Behavioural economics on a post-it number 26, dynamic inconsistency. Dynamic inconsistency is considered to be a violation of standard rational choice theory that's informed or caused, if you like, by the notion of present bias, caused by present bias. I always think of Daniel Reed when I think about dynamic inconsistency. Daniel and his colleagues, I think, have written quite important articles on this notion. And I'm going to sort of try to illustrate some of his points, I think, in this little post-it. Okay, so in standard rational choice theory, if somebody prefers one particular good over another good, then say they prefer good A over good B, then they should prefer in the immediate moment, then they should prefer A over B consistently through time. But when particular items are associated more heavily with present bias than other items, you can get inconsistencies in preferences across time caused by present bias. So I'm just going to try to illustrate this with this little diagram here. Hopefully I'll get this right. So I'm illustrating this with two, you could consider them to be two desserts, I suppose. One of those desserts is arguably tastier, but the other dessert is relatively healthier, I suppose, for the individual. So, or considered to be relatively healthier by most people. So I'm illustrating this with cheesecake and apple. Cheesecakes and apples. All right. So imagine you've got an individual, and if they were asked to choose between a cheesecake and an apple in the immediate moment, in the present moment, then assume, as perhaps because of present bias, that they place a higher value upon the cheesecake. This is the value function for the cheesecake, than the value they place upon the apple. This is the value function through time for the apple, right? So if they were to do that, if they were to prefer cheesecake over the apple in the immediate moment, in the present moment, then according to standard rational choice theory, assuming exponential discounting that we talked about in the previous post-it note, then if we were to ask people to pre-commit to a particular type of dessert, say at time t, that could be any time in the future, so say for example 1 week from now, then that person still ought to, according to standard rational choice theory, because they prefer cheesecake over the apple in the immediate moment, they should therefore want to pre-commit to choosing the cheesecake over the apple at time t, one week from now. However, because of these differential rates of discounting for the two goods, with cheesecake particularly associated with present bias, or as we talked about in the previous post-it note, hyperbolic discounting, then it might be that when they're imagining the future 1 week from now, they would expect that they would be placing a higher value upon the apple at time t than they would be upon the cheesecake at time t, right? So their preferences across those two times, in the immediate moment and their pre-commitment, differ. There's what's called a dynamic inconsistency in their preferences. Now, if they were at this point here at the present, and a week passed, 1 week were to pass, and if those individuals were then asked if they'd be willing to change if they'd be wanting, I should say, to change their dessert choice that they'd pre-committed to 1 week ago, then essentially at this point time t, they would be operating at the present moment again. And many of them, because of this present bias that's particularly associated with cheesecakes, would then wish to switch again their cheesecake preference, cheesecake to apple preference, to be one where they would prefer the cheesecake rather than the apple over the apple. Right? So, I guess an implication of all of this is if you were minded to try to get people to eat healthier dessert options, then if all of this is at work, you would be wanting to try to ask people to pre-commit to their dessert choices, if you were of a mind to do that, 1 week from now or whatever time t from now, rather than to get them to choose, in the immediate moment, and not allow them to reverse their pre-commitments once the immediate moment has arisen. So that's essentially what dynamic inconsistency is saying, is that you can get inconsistent preference orderings over time that's essentially caused by this notion of present bias being attached to particular goods. And that's all I've kind of summarised here. That's all I've said here. Okay, so that's dynamic inconsistency. In the next post-it note, short post-it video, which will be number 27, I'm going to move on to the requirements, 27, and then a few more videos after that. I'm going to move on to the requirements, or the original requirements, of some of the various behavioural public policy frameworks, and these will include things such as nudge, shoves, budges, etc. Okay, so that's dynamic inconsistency, behavioural economics, and post-it number 26.